So everybody has the handouts from last time, which was just the class syllabus. And then there was the lecture handout. It's not that one. It's this one, yeah, with the levels of organization. And then the second thing gets into the body cavities. We did the levels of organization part at the top, but we did not get into body cavities. So our to-do list today is finish everything that we didn't go through last time. We'll end up talking about dorsal versus ventral body cavity. We'll finish the rest of our first PowerPoint that goes through the 11 organ systems. And then towards the end of that, we'll talk a little bit about homeostasis. Maybe keep in mind which of these organ systems are responsible for maintaining homeostasis. One of them is not. And then by the time we get through that, it'll be time to transition into lab. And our lab today is just going to be introducing ourselves to the different types of tissues. So I've got a concept map that I'll pass out when we get to this part. It's already printed over there for you. We'll draw something on the board. And then our lab part is to visually try and recognize these tissue types. And on the first day, we've got laminated pictures of all of these. And to be honest with you, it's probably these same laminated cards that I'm going to use for the lab practicals. We're going to scatter them out. So a tip would be if you wanted to take pictures of each of these, then in your phone you could flip through the pictures and see the things that you're likely to be tested over. This is just to kind of introduce us to them today. On Thursday, I'm going to try and have microscopes in here that I will have set up as a demonstration so that you can look through the microscopes and kind of look around at different parts of the tissue. You won't be tested over the microscope work, just the way the pictures look here. That's really out of a safety measure because sometimes I'll set the microscopes up one way and somebody may bump the arrow and it moves to a different part of the tissue, and I don't notice that until everybody's taken their practical. So we will look at the microscopes, but it won't be something we'll be tested over. Likely to be these same pictures. What else? Any questions about our to-do list at all? I've got the lecture handout from last time. We're going to try and pick up where we left off. I think I'm rolling back there.
Can I have mine back?
Yes, you can have yours back. I'm bad about that.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, so the last time we were here, we did our Twinkie dissection lab, and we looked at the 4 different planes of symmetry. I say 4 because we made a distinction between the sagittal plane. We called this a mid-sagittal plane because it split the body into equal left and right pieces, as opposed to what we called a parasagittal plane that was not directly in the midline of the body. But it did separate the body, or the Twinkie in your case, into left and right pieces, just unequal left and right pieces. New stuff for today is to finish our anatomical terminology stuff, which we really just had to get into the body cavities. There are 2 main body cavities that we need to be aware of. And in your lecture notes, you'll see this is the very next thing. When we look at, I'll just come over here and do it. When we look at the dorsal body cavity, your lecture notes have dorsal body cavity. And underneath dorsal body cavity, we're going to see the cranial cavity and then vertebral cavity. Both nested within the dorsal cavity of the body. The cranial cavity we're going to see houses the brain, and the vertebral cavity is going to house the spinal cord. This dorsal body cavity is obviously on the dorsal side of the body that we mentioned. There is a ventral body cavity that will be subdivided into what we will call the thoracic cavity. The chest above the diaphragm, and then the other part is the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, good enough. that gets us through some of that question. Let's look at this a little bit more closely. If we look inside that ventral body cavity, we're going to see this thoracic cavity and abdominopelvic cavity. Kind of looking at the actual picture of it, the dorsal body cavity we can see along the dorsal side of the body. Specifically, the cranial cavity houses the brain, and this is the vertebral cavity that houses that spinal cord. So everything in yellow is our dorsal body cavity. Everything in kind of a red color is our ventral body cavity. That line, the diaphragm, is what separates our thoracic cavity above from the abdominopelvic cavity below. From this side view, you can see abdominal cavity sits above the pelvic cavity. Down in the pelvic cavity, we're going to see things like reproductive organs and urinary structures. The abdominal cavity is going to house mostly digestive structures. And the thoracic cavity, we're going to see lungs, heart, and some of the major blood vessels like the aorta, as well as the esophagus and trachea. So this thoracic cavity, if we look closely, this is where your lab takes that ventral cavity and it divides it into letter A, which is the thoracic cavity, superior, surrounded by the ribs and muscles of the chest wall. Then there's letter B, the abdominopelvic cavity. It's inferior, surrounded by those abdominal walls and pelvic girdle. But in number 3, it looks at the thoracic cavity a little bit more closely, and you can see there is a right pleural cavity and a left pleural cavity. Each right and left pleural cavity house their own lung. Let me see if I have I was trying to see if I had a zoomed in picture of that. And we don't, but we're talking about these 2 pleural cavities. Each houses its own lung, so there is a left and right pleural cavity. And then there's this area called the mediastinum, which is the next thing that you should write next to letter C. The mediastinum is going to contain the heart, which is inside its own pericardial cavity, plus those other structures that I said, the esophagus and the trachea. Here's a picture of that mediastinum area. It's in between the 2 pleural cavities. It is going to house the heart, which is in its own pericardial cavity, as well as the trachea, the esophagus, and some of those major blood vessels like the aorta. Okay, so that takes us to the second page, and that's where we get into these quadrants. There are 4 abdominopelvic quadrants, and the navel area is where we use the transecting lines. There are 4 quadrants. There is what we would call the upper right quadrant, the right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, and left lower quadrant. This isn't as commonly used as what we will see next, the 9 abdominopelvic regions, but it might be, worth noting that if you are talking to somebody that's having pain in the right upper quadrant, then that could be something to do with the liver or the gallbladder, potentially. If it's the right lower quadrant, maybe it's pain coming from the appendix. Left lower quadrant is going to house the distal end of the colon. The left upper quadrant, it's hard to see in here, but you would have the spleen, a filtering organ. So maybe if you're having pain coming from the upper left quadrant, one organ that could be affected is the spleen. So just kind of having an idea of some of the structures that sit behind these 4 quadrants would be helpful. But more commonly used are going to be these 9 abdominopelvic regions. If I didn't show it last time, here's how those are likely to end up on the practical. I bet it's still got tape on it. And it does. So these are just chest plates that we took off of the abdominal or the torso models. One of them, the tape has been removed, but you can see it was taped off in the 4 quadrants. The one that is more recently used are the 9 abdominopelvic regions. So I could end up putting the number in any one of these 9 abdominopelvic regions. And how we can know them, for me, I always start in the middle. Here is the umbilical region. There is where you would find the navel or attachment of the umbilical cord. It is flanked on either side by lumbar regions. So there's the right and left lumbar regions. Think lower back region for the lumbar region. If we go above that, so above this umbilical region would be just above the stomach. So it's called epigastric, just to the above area of the stomach. The epigastric area is, this epigastric region is flanked on either side by the hypochondriac region. Let's break that down. Hypo is going to always refer to below. Chondriac is always going to refer to cartilage. So if I can grab this skeleton back here. Well, I'll use this one because it's on wheels. Hello. You were here last time, so I know you've got the syllabus and the lecture handout from last time. There is one open spot on the back row, and if there isn't a chair, you're welcome to grab this one. I think there's one there. I was just grabbing the skeleton model because we were talking about some of the 9 abdominopelvic regions. In particular, we were going to talk about those hypochondriac regions. And hypo is below, chondriac is cartilage, so it's referring to one of these abdominopelvic regions that's just below the costal cartilage of the ribs. So just below the cartilage on either side, hypochondriac. There's the right hypochondriac region and the left hypochondriac region. If we now go down below the umbilical region, in the middle there's the pubic region or hypogastric region below the stomach. You could refer to it as pubic region or hypogastric. It is flanked on either side by inguinal regions, these groin regions. Left inguinal region and right inguinal region. If we could peel away what's underneath the inguinal region, we would see some bone structures like this flat bone that we will call the ilium, and there are going to be blood vessels that move along the inside of that bone that we will call iliac arteries and veins. Those are found within this inguinal region. So 9 abdominopelvic regions. I think that takes us through body cavities and body regions. But I threw these next few slides in here. They're kind of showing up out of order. We're going to get to the tissues concept map. And towards the end of that lab, we introduced these 3 different tissue let me say that again. Towards the end of this lab, we introduced 3 different body membranes. This is one of those pictures. I'll save that for the end of lab. Let's jump back into chapter 1 stuff. So we got through anatomical terminology. We talked about what's in the dorsal and what's in the ventral cavity. So let's now jump back to introduce those 11 organ systems and eventually talk about homeostasis and give examples of positive and negative feedback. I'm looking at the rest of the lecture handout to make sure there's nothing I need to say. Maybe there is. Here's the sheet that I'm thinking about, and I'm going to scroll through here because some of these pictures might not be obvious. This is a picture of a shoulder region, and this is from an arm that has been pulled too hard, and there is bruising in this area. This is number 7. Yes, that's the armpit region. So number 7, bruising is in which area of the body? This goes along with the other anatomical terminology part that we went through last time. One of the terms that we used to mention this armpit region was axillary region.
I have a question.
Yes?
On the other slide in the book, in the textbook, it says that these 2 areas are iliac regions, and on the presentation it said
That's right. So we will see as we go through the entire semester old terms and newer terms that can be used for the same body part. So that's why I explained within that inguinal region, you see the iliac arteries and iliac veins, the bone that we would refer to the ilium, and that's why that region is sometimes also referred to as the iliac region. So we would be thinking of the same part. So old terms and new terms. You're welcome to use either one whenever we get into descriptive terms. So yes, this is number 7, the armpit region. So one of the terms we used to describe armpit region was axillary. Let's see some of the other pictures. This is somebody taking blood from the inside of the elbow. What did we call that inside part of the elbow? Antecubital. And then the back side of the elbow, not on here at all. This was the olecranon region. Let's see what else we have. Number 17, this is somebody laying in the prone position. If they were in the supine position, they would be looking up at the ceiling. And then we have some questions here. Which letter correctly identifies the leg? And I used that last time. The thing that I'm swinging around is not the well, it is, part of it is the leg. This entire lower extremity is separated into the area above the knee, which we call the thigh, and then the area below the knee, which is the leg. So B would represent the leg, A would represent the thigh. And what else do we have? Hopefully we can see all of those questions. Which letter correctly identifies the arm? Well, remember the arm would be above the elbow, between the shoulder and the elbow. The forearm would be letter C. Looks like D is the olecranon region that we mentioned. And digits would be either the fingers or the toes in this case. I left off letter E, which is the lumbar region. I don't know if that's even a question. Yes, the last one, the lumbar region, would be letter E. So nice review of anatomical terms that we mentioned last time. If I left anything off there, if there's questions from the anatomical term list from last time, always interrupt me. I'm going to go backwards into our chapter 1 slides. And we'll start with our introduction to the 11 organ systems. We're going to introduce all 11. We'll kind of briefly give an overview of some of the things each organ system does. And you might see multiple choice questions, either on the quiz or on the exam, describing some of the overall function of each of these organ systems. Throughout this semester, we're really going to look in depth into half of them. We get all the way up to the nervous system, and then we will look further in detail into the other half of the organ systems in the second half of the class. So here we go with the first organ system out of 11. It is the integument system, or the skin. We've got a couple of integument models that we will look at. I'll set them out. Well, these are identical. And there's another one that looks like this. The integument is going to be an organ that is important because it basically separates the outside environment from the inside environment. We can see it covers the entire body. Also, in addition to covering the body, we're going to see that the hair, your nails, and glands like sweat glands are all part of this integument system. I'll say that it has clinical importance because it is an organ system that you can easily evaluate and you don't have to be invasive at all. It can tell you a lot about somebody's circulation. You can tell whether somebody is hypothermic or hyperthermic. If their face is red and their ears are red and they're really trying to cool off, that tells you something about circulation versus being blue in the face or trying to conserve your body heat. It also tells you something about hydration, how elastic the tissue is. So integument system, we'll say skin, hair, nails, and glands. The second organ system will be the skeletal system. We've got a skeleton in the front of the room. Some of the obvious functions of the skeletal system is protection of those internal organs. It also gives us support from gravity. We can stand up and walk around with the help of the bones. That's why bones are sometimes grouped into the function of movement. If it weren't for the bones acting as levers for my muscles to pull on, I would just be a bag of skin and muscles twitching on the ground. I wouldn't be able to move around as easily. So the bones act as levers to help pull us around. In addition to protection and support, we're going to see that bones are actually going to store nutrients in the form of calcium and phosphate. There is a certain amount of calcium that needs to stay in the bloodstream, and we can regulate how much calcium is in the bloodstream or how little calcium is in the bloodstream by building bone tissue. You need calcium to build bone tissue, and the calcium is removed from the bloodstream to build new bone tissue. If we need more calcium in the bloodstream, then bones can dissolve. Certain cells will dissolve bone, and that calcium is released back into the bloodstream. So it's a repository for things like calcium. We're also going to see, this is a bone model that's one of the few places that will show us areas of red bone marrow. We'll see pictures of this, but red bone marrow is going to be the site of blood cell formation. We will learn that red blood cells on average will last about 120 days, depending on how hard you are on your red blood cells. Old red blood cells are removed by the spleen. So that means there has to be a constant new supply of red blood cells to move into the bloodstream. There is, and that new supply of red blood cells comes from red bone marrow. That's found within the middle of spongy bone tissue. So bone is going to store nutrients. It's going to supply us with new blood cells. It is also there for protection and support and movement. The muscle system, also involved in movement. It's what pulls those bones around to get us to write notes on the page or walk around the room. In addition to helping you write notes or move around, muscles are going to help generate heat when it gets too cold. Thankfully, it's not as hot anymore as it was last week, and before too long, it's going to be so cold that we'll need to shiver a little bit whenever we're moving between the building and our car to warm up. So movement and production of heat. The next organ system that we get into is the digestive system. This is going to be a system that helps break down food, first mechanically breaking down food into small enough pieces that you can swallow it, and then chemically breaking down the food in your stomach and small intestines to tiny enough pieces that it can be absorbed into the bloodstream. So first we have to ingest and then break the food down into small enough pieces that it can actually be pulled into the bloodstream. That is the absorption of the nutrients. It's delivered all over the body. Excess nutrients is going to be stored in the liver. But then the waste is going to have to make its way out, so excretion of the waste is the final function of the digestive system. Next system to introduce is the respiratory system. We'll see the lungs are going to function as exchange surfaces for carbon dioxide and oxygen. It's maybe the first thing that you think about is that my cells need oxygen in order to survive. And that is true, but maybe more important than getting oxygen to your cells is getting rid of the carbon dioxide that might build up around cells. Here's where I will draw something. We're going to mention something that comes into play in the second half of this class when we talk about what's in the bloodstream. Let's just let this represent a capillary. And inside the capillary, we are going to see the components of blood. A lot of the components of blood are going to be red blood cells. I'll draw in a big dotted line one of these white blood cells. And then you've got tiny fragments of a cell that we will call a platelet. These are all cells. These are formed elements of the bloodstream. The rest of the stuff, white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, are going to make up about 45% of the things in the bloodstream. 45% of blood. The other 55% is going to be mostly water. So lots of water molecules. There are going to be plasma proteins. And nutrients like glucose. We might as well throw some ions in there like sodium ions and potassium ions. We talked about calcium ions, so I'll throw a few of those in there. The main component of the things in the bloodstream is water. And whenever there is excess carbon dioxide, we're going to use this color for carbon dioxide. There are gases in here like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Red blood cells are going to carry around oxygen and carbon dioxide, but about 10% of this carbon dioxide is going to travel through the blood plasma. When there's excess carbon dioxide that mixes with a water molecule, this leads to a chemical reaction that goes like this. These molecules combine and they form a molecule of carbonic acid. This is what we will see this several times throughout the rest of the semester. We will recognize it as carbonic acid. This carbonic acid is an unstable molecule. It will split into two pieces. It falls apart into one piece that looks like this. It's lost a hydrogen, so it now roams around with a negative charge. We refer to this molecule as bicarbonate. That is one half. The other half that this breaks into is an individual hydrogen ion that is now roaming around with a positive charge. We typically refer to this thing as just a hydrogen ion. So I'll say hydrogen ion, or I'll just draw it with an H+. That's half of this carbonic acid. And you can see the problem here. If you have too much carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, if each one of these things is going to end up going through this chemical reaction where we end up with an excess hydrogen ion, this is going to cause the pH of the blood to get out of whack. Any of these free hydrogen ions in the bloodstream can be problematic. We need a certain amount, but too many are going to cause these proteins in the blood to unravel and denature and not be able to function. So one of the main functions of this respiratory system, to get back to what the respiratory system does, is it gets rid of this excess carbon dioxide at the same time as pulling in oxygen for the cells. So getting rid of carbon dioxide, there's some type of direct relationship between how much carbon dioxide is in the bloodstream and how many of these free hydrogen ions we have. More case studies to come on that. It's how basically the respiratory system is able to help control the pH of the bloodstream. If you need more of these hydrogen ions in the bloodstream, your respiratory system will slow down and you will hypoventilate. Or if you've ever seen somebody be told to breathe into a paper bag, I remember thinking as a kid, why would anybody ever want to breathe into a paper bag and then inhale their own carbon dioxide? Well, sometimes what happens is if people get in, I've seen this happen where a student had to draw their own blood. This was years ago when we had to draw our own blood for labs. And it turns out they were very comfortable drawing other people's blood, but they had never drawn their own blood. And they had gotten all worked up and they started hyperventilating. And if anybody hyperventilates for too long, it looks like this. They're freaking out. They're hyperventilating, and when you do that, you're blowing off your excess CO2. Too little, if we don't have enough CO2, then we don't have enough of these hydrogen ions. So there's a certain amount that are tolerable in the bloodstream. If we need more hydrogen ions, one of the things you can do is you want to hold on to excess carbon dioxide. So you would be told to grab a paper bag and then exhale into that paper bag and then inhale your carbon dioxide. You need more carbon dioxide in the bloodstream if you are in one of those situations where you're hyperventilating. So by adjusting CO2 levels in the bloodstream, we can adjust hydrogen ion levels in the bloodstream. Okay. Long way of saying the respiratory system has a dual function of getting oxygen to cells, but also help regulating the pH of the blood by holding on to or getting rid of carbon dioxide. Next system is the cardiovascular system. We actually spend, I want to say, 3 or 4 days talking about the cardiovascular system, because the first thing that we talk about with the cardiovascular system is the blood itself. We will map out all of the things that are in the blood, and once we know about the fluid, we then investigate the pump. We spend a couple of days talking about the heart, the organ that circulates that fluid around. And then in our 4th day, we talk about the blood vessels, the path that this fluid takes as it moves around the body. And that's where we get into labeling these things: common iliac arteries, internal iliac arteries, or external iliac arteries in the iliac region or inguinal region. So cardiovascular system is a big one. Then we have the lymphatic system. This lymphatic system is responsible for collecting fluid that leaks out of capillary beds and returning that fluid back to the circulatory system. In fact, let me see. Oh, I don't. When we get into the lymphatic system, we will see how these tiny little lymphatic capillaries are tangled in with our normal blood capillaries. Any of our normal capillaries in the body, they leak fluid. A common example of that would be the capillaries in the feet. Since if you're on your feet all day, the fluid that leaks out of those capillaries, gravity kind of holds it down in the feet. And it's one of the reasons they say to shop for shoes at the end of the day rather than the beginning of the day, because your feet may accumulate some of that excess fluid. And it's another reason why it's good to prop your feet up at the end of the night so that that fluid can redistribute through the rest of the body. The lymphatic system does not have a pump that circulates the fluid through it. It uses the help of skeletal muscles that surround these vessels. And that's also why going for a walk at the end of the night and using the skeletal muscles in your legs, it's going to help move fluid through these lymphatic vessels. Here's something that we will write on the board and do multiple times. The lymphatic system is responsible for maintaining blood volume. This will be my abbreviation for blood volume. Blood volume is going to be directly related, let me get that out of the way. Blood volume is directly related to blood pressure. So if you increase blood volume, it's directly related, it's going to increase blood pressure. You could drink a bottle of water and that's going to increase blood pressure. You're increasing blood volume. If you are hemorrhaging blood, you're losing blood volume. Or if you're severely dehydrated, you're losing blood volume, that's going to decrease blood pressure. Anyway, blood volume is tied to blood pressure. It's also tied to filtration rates of the kidneys when we get into the urinary system, which I thought was the next one. The lymphatic system, we can see a collection of vessels. There are also some organs like the spleen and the tonsils that are responsible for housing a lot of our immune cells, T cells and B cells. That's where this second bullet point of protecting against infection kind of makes its way into the lymphatic system. In each of the nodes of the lymphatic system, it's going to house many of the T cells and B cells that fight infections. The nervous system is another big one. We spend several weeks talking about the nervous system at the end of this semester. The 4th unit and the 5th unit are all nervous system. And it's an important one, maybe something that you can put a star next to, because it is one of the 2 master control systems of the rest of the body. Of all 11 organ systems, 2 of them kind of get special designation as master control systems. The nervous system is one, and the endocrine system is the other. They both control other organ systems, but they do so in different ways. The nervous system is going to use these rapid electrical impulses that quickly go from one part of the body to the next by way of these neurons. The endocrine system, we're going to learn, is a collection of glands that are scattered throughout the body. They produce chemical signals that have to hop into a blood vessel, and that blood vessel carries them slowly to the organ that they are targeting, and then they have their effect. So it could take minutes, it could take hours for these endocrine system hormones to control another organ system. The nervous system, it's quick, it's a millisecond. If I want to wiggle my big toe, I can make it wiggle. Here is a picture of the endocrine system. We can see the collection of scattered glands throughout the body. We will learn each gland. We will learn which hormone that it produces and the target of that particular hormone. So again, another one of these master control systems, but it uses slow-moving chemical signals that have to travel through the bloodstream. Here's the urinary system. This urinary system is going to be important because it is the main way in which we can get rid of certain things that we don't need in the body, like excess hydrogen ions. If the blood is too acidic, we can get rid of this acid by urinating it out. We will learn that if the blood is acidic, the urine is also going to be acidic because it's going to help get rid of whatever is in excess in the bloodstream. If the blood is alkaline, the urine is also going to be alkaline. So we're going to see it filters things out of the bloodstream, waste, ions. The last system to introduce is the reproductive system, and this is the only organ system that is not involved in homeostasis. We'll see the other 10 organ systems are all necessary. You couldn't survive missing any of those other 10 organ systems. The reproductive system, however, its job is just to produce gametes and then also store and nourish those gametes, but it is not involved in homeostasis. We'll see components of the female and male reproductive system. Again, production of gametes, housing and protecting those gametes until they're needed. So I'm talking about the relationship between these organ systems, and I was mentioning that 10 of those organ systems function in homeostasis. The only one that doesn't is the reproductive system. This is a picture of a box that is trying to represent the internal environment of the body. And in the middle of this box, we can see a collection of cells. And your body is made of trillions and trillions of these cells. Each one is producing waste that it needs to get rid of, and it needs nutrients. And you've got a collection of organ systems that are all set up to remove excess waste from those cells and feed them nutrients when needed. And all 10 organ systems, with the exception of the reproductive system, have a role to play. We can see the digestive system is the first one that is responsible for ingestion of nutrients. We mentioned it has to be physically and chemically broken down into small enough pieces that it could be absorbed into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, it's going to be carried all over the body to deliver nutrients to those cells. It also has to get rid of the excess waste. There is, just jumping over here, we can see there is the kidney system or urinary system. The kidneys are going to have a bunch of blood vessels that go to them. They filter the blood and remove excess waste, excess hydrogen ions. We can see the integument system representing the wall here, the box itself that separates the outside environment from the inside environment. We said digestive system maintains a certain level of nutrients. Urinary system helps wash away some of the waste. We said the, what am I trying to say here? Respiratory system is delivering oxygen to those cells and also helping remove that buildup of carbon dioxide. Then we can see the cardiovascular system, that is the blood circulating these nutrients. It's the heart that creates the current, is the pump for that fluid, as well as the blood vessels themselves, the route that this blood takes to get to those cells. Not shown on here are things like the lymphatic system or the immune system, or reproductive system for that matter. But we said 10 of those organ systems are responsible for maintaining homeostasis, and I've heard some long-winded definitions of homeostasis, and we can do better than that. We can boil it down to just 3 words. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain internal consistency. And I can maybe draw an example of that. We will see a lot of graphs that look just like this. But in homeostasis, there's always some type of tolerable range that we need to stay within. And if we get outside of that tolerable range, there are certain triggers that are set up to keep us within this tolerable range. So maybe my favorite example is the blood glucose example. We will see blood glucose. Our blood glucose levels in milligrams per deciliter, we can see time down here that we will put in hours. We're graphing one of those glucose tolerance tests. Normal glucose levels are anywhere between 110 and 70 milligrams per deciliter as our tolerable range. Anything outside of that is abnormal and will need to be corrected as soon as possible. Let's say we start our day out like this, and then we maybe skip lunch like I did today. And if you happen to skip lunch, then your blood glucose levels are going to get below normal. And neurons won't function properly. You'll start saying weird things. This needs to be corrected. And as soon as we drop below our normal levels of glucose, there is a signal that is sent to some cells in the pancreas that produce glucagon. Glucagon has the effect of increasing our blood glucose levels, bringing us right back up within that tolerable range of 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. But now I go and eat lunch, and I eat a big Snickers bar or something, so my blood glucose levels are well above where they should be. And in this case, there is another one of those chemical signals that go to other cells in the pancreas that get them to release insulin. This is going to have the effect of bringing down our blood glucose levels. So insulin takes us right back down within this normal range. And thankfully, with the 2 signals of glucagon and insulin, we can stay within this tolerable range. So having a set point and being able to maintain internal consistency despite fluctuations like skipping lunch or eating a big bag of Halloween candy, you can maintain consistent blood glucose levels. You do the same thing with body temperature as well. Like I said, muscles can shiver in order to generate heat. Yeah, bless you. The main master control systems of the body, we said, were the nervous system and the endocrine system. And both nervous system and endocrine system are going to be set up to help regulate a variety of internal situations. The 3 components of this homeostatic mechanism, there are always receptors in the body that are able to detect when we get outside of our tolerable range. So receptors are constantly seeing when we get outside of these ranges. There is a control center, which is either the nervous system or the endocrine system, that has to decide what the proper response is. In the example that I'm using here, it's the endocrine system that's deciding what the proper response is. Those cells of the pancreas that produce glucagon or insulin. Once the proper response is decided, in this case, blood glucose levels are too low, the response would be to release glucagon. Glucagon has the effect of bringing up blood glucose levels and taking us right back into that tolerable range. So the first component we can see is the receptor that detects the change, detects us getting outside of the normal range. The control centers, either the nervous system or endocrine system, decide what the proper response is, and then that response is carried out by the effectors. In this case, glucagon would be that effector that would increase blood glucose levels. This is not unlike the graph that we have already drawn on the board that shows this ability to maintain an internal consistency. The normal range, even though there's not a specific example here, this could be body temperature. It could be hydrogen ion concentration in the bloodstream, or calcium ion, or even glucose measurements in the bloodstream. There's a tolerable range, and if we get outside of that tolerable range, then there are mechanisms that get us right back towards that set point. All right, this is a picture that describes the steps that we were just referring to in a broad, general way. There is initially some type of stabilization in the internal environment. But let's say I leave here and I eat a big Snickers bar. So now there's an imbalance. There is an increase in glucose in my bloodstream because I had to get the king-size Snickers bar. And receptors in my bloodstream detect that elevated blood glucose level. So the control center in our example are cells in the pancreas that detect that elevated blood glucose level. These we will call beta cells in the pancreas, and they release insulin, which responds by bringing those glucose levels right back down and balancing the system out. Specific examples could be temperature, and there are two examples on this slide. If we go the lower route first, you can see that the stimulus in this case is the body temperature dropping. We're getting too cold. So there are nervous receptors in the skin that can sense whether you're getting too cold. If those cells sense that you're getting too cold, then the response is going to be sent by nerves to muscle tissue, getting the muscles to shiver. That shivering, again, heats us up and reestablishes that balance. Let me write this down because I realize I'm giving examples of the same thing, and there are some words that we can put to it. We're talking about homeostasis and positive or negative feedback. Let's distinguish these two, positive versus negative feedback. So bringing those up here, we're going to see that in negative feedback, it's always the case that the response is going to counter the stimulus. The response is going to counter the stimulus. It runs completely opposite of what the stimulus is. The stimulus in this case, if we go down the lower route, is the body is getting too cold. So the response is to shiver and warm us back up. That's the opposite of what the stimulus was. It brings us back in the tolerable range. And even if we look at the above example, in the above example, the stimulus is that the body is getting too hot. So the response over here is for the sweat glands to release sweat and to cool ourselves off. Stimulus is we are too hot. Response is to cool off. If the response counters whatever the stimulus is, you're looking at an example of negative feedback. All of these examples are examples of negative feedback. The stimulus is our blood glucose levels are getting too low. So the response is to do the opposite of that. Bring them back up within the tolerable range. This is negative feedback. Even this is negative feedback because our stimulus was I ate a Snickers bar and my blood glucose are now too high. So the response would be to do the opposite of the blood glucose levels getting too high. That's release insulin and bring them right back down. Stimulus is elevated blood glucose levels. Response is to reduce those blood glucose levels. Negative feedback. I just used the example of body temperature. We've mapped on the board the ways the endocrine system regulates blood glucose levels. If you're interested, this is a slide that shows what we just graphed on the board. For example, if we take the top part of this picture, you can see the stimulus is blood glucose levels are too high. This would be this part of the graph where I've eaten a Snickers bar, and the blood glucose levels are triggering cells of the pancreas, specifically those beta cells, and getting them to release the insulin. We know insulin works by reducing blood glucose levels, so the response is bringing down glucose levels. Stimulus is glucose levels are too high. Response is the opposite of that, bringing them back down. The lower part of this picture is this part of the graph where I skipped lunch and blood glucose levels are now too low. Thankfully, there are also cells in the pancreas, the alpha cells, that release glucagon. And this has the response of taking things like lipids and proteins and breaking them down and building new glucose molecules, gluconeogenesis. Your brain only is fueled by glucose, and so you have to be able to build new glucose cells. You have to be able to build new glucose molecules if you are running low on glucose. So glucagon is one of these chemical signals that causes the body to build its own glucose molecules and increase the level of glucose in the bloodstream. Again, stimulus is too low blood glucose. The response is to bring it right back up within the tolerable range. So those are all good examples of negative feedback. Let's say this is negative feedback. I always thought this is worth mentioning in the first week of an A&P class because negative feedback is not like bad reviews, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about a response that counters the stimulus. And positive feedback is not what I do to my dog and tell him good job. Positive feedback in the terms of A&P, to write this down, in positive feedback, the response is going to reinforce the stimulus. So we will say response is going to reinforce the stimulus. Positive feedback is not helpful for maintaining homeostasis. So if we're thinking about homeostasis, the nod to helping maintain homeostasis is really achieved by negative feedback. Positive feedback is less common in the body, but we will see it in a few places, like in labor and delivery. We will also see it in the blood clotting. We also might talk about it when neurons fire. There are brief examples of positive feedback. Let's look at one. Our first example of positive feedback is just in the labor and delivery process. It starts with, we can see this is a fetus that's pushing against the walls of the cervix, and there are nerve receptors there. So the receptors in this case would be nerve endings that detect a stretch in the walls of the cervix. And then that is sending a signal back to the brain that is a part of the brain that produces, I should correctly say that it releases a hormone called oxytocin. This oxytocin, as it is released into the bloodstream, travels down to the muscles of the uterine wall, and it causes those muscles in the uterine wall to contract even more vigorously. So you can imagine if the contractions in the uterine wall become even more vigorous, this is going to reinforce the fetus pushing against the walls of the cervix. So that pushing is going to increase even further, and we're now in one of these positive feedback loops, where as the pushing increases, this is just sending more signals to the brain saying release more oxytocin, and as more oxytocin is released, we get an even more vigorous contraction, which causes even more pushing against the cervical wall. So this positive feedback loop continues to escalate until delivery. Afterwards, then the whole thing shuts down because there is no more stimulus, no more stretching against the walls of the cervix. No more signal to the brain saying send more oxytocin. So the contraction of the uterine walls slow down. Maybe the other example of positive feedback is something that you don't have to worry about anymore this year, hopefully. But you remember a couple of weeks ago, for the longest time, we had temperatures that were above like 105 or 106 degrees outside. And if the temperature is above 107 degrees outside, you'll see on the news that there are warnings about, don't go outside and run or exert yourself if the temperature outside is above 107 degrees. And I mention that because you will see people that just assume that they are so physically fit that they can push the limits of human physiology. And I personally like to watch a lot of those crazy shows where people go out and try and survive in these really tough conditions. And you'll hear sometimes people say, oh, it's just the will to survive that gets you through certain situations. And that is not true. What gets you through certain situations is knowing the limits of human physiology. And that is really what's going to save you. So one example of that is this skin or body temperature. I say skin and body temperature. If we let this line represent the skin, you have two different body temperatures. There is the surface body temperature. Need to get rid of that one. Our surface body temperature is somewhere around 98.6 degrees. Hopefully we can see that. But if you've ever had your core body temperature sample, that's when they put that thin little tube, sometimes down your nose, into the central cavity of your body. And you can get a core body temperature reading that is usually somewhere around 101 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll just say. 101 degrees Fahrenheit. And you constantly have blood that circulates from the surface down towards the core of the body as it makes its way to the heart, and then the heart circulates that blood back out towards the surface. So the blood is constantly doing this circulation. And here let me grab some other colors. The area above the skin, let's make this a nice sunny day outside. If the temperature outside, the air temp, is, we'll say, about 76 degrees Fahrenheit. It's a nice cool morning and you're going for a jog. As that blood makes its way up to the surface, you can see temperature is always going to go from high to low. So we can see heat dissipate from the surface of the skin. And this is typically how it happens unless it's too hot outside. The body's normally trying to regulate temperature this way, but if something happens where the outside body temp or the outside air temperature is anywhere above 107 degrees Fahrenheit, what starts to happen is obviously your body's response to cool off is to send more blood out towards the surface. And the attempt here for the body is for heat to go out, to cool off. But if it's hotter outside than it is in your core body temperature, the arrows here for heat are going to be going the opposite direction. This is just additional blood that is being kind of pushed underneath the heating lights, in this case the outside temperature. So your blood at the surface is going to start to heat up. And if this blood at the surface starts to heat up above the level of 100, let's put this at 102 degrees Fahrenheit, this is going to end up sending blood back down to the core body temperature that increases our core body temperature. If this happens, the body's response is, okay, our only response to cool off is to send even more blood out to the surface. And you can see we're going to quickly end up in one of these positive feedback loops where now there's even more blood at the surface that can pick up additional heat. And we rapidly get this runaway mechanism where surface body temperature goes to 3, core body temperature goes to 103. Then it quickly runs up. If anything gets above 107 degrees Fahrenheit, then those proteins in the bloodstream will start to unravel and denature. They can't carry things around like they should, and you get body-wide, massive shutdown, failure. Okay. I'm somewhat torn about this board space because we have these kind of vertical dividing lines. I'm going to just try and ignore those vertical dividing lines, and I'm going to start in this area, and we're just going to list 4 tissue types. There are only 4 tissue types in the body, and we're going to make a list of all 4 of them. I'll try and stay consistent in my colors that I use. So let's go, first we're going to go all the way, I'll just use this color, it's easy to see. We're going to come all the way over here, and we're going to make a box for epithelial tissue. I'm realizing that. Can you see this at all? No? Okay, that's what I thought. Maybe this will work for a color for epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is going to be our first type of tissue that we talk about. We can describe epithelial tissue as covering body surfaces. I'll just say covers body surfaces. That's going to be outside surfaces of the body like our skin, but also inside surfaces of the body like the digestive tract, the respiratory tract, the urinary tract. And when we look at the different types of epithelial cells, we're going to see 3 different shapes. So I'll just bring 3 different lines out. One type of epithelial tissue is going to be called squamous epithelial tissue. And this is easily recognizable because we're going to see the cells are kind of these flat pancake-shaped cells. So the nucleus is usually stretched out, kind of thin like this. So it looks like a fried egg or a pancake. We've got squamous-shaped cells. Let's bring this next one down and write our cuboidal-shaped epithelial cells. Cuboidal-shaped cells are, I'm going to draw them kind of with these soft edges because it's not like they are box-shaped, but what we can say about these cuboidal-shaped cells is they are about as tall as they are wide. So here's a cuboidal-shaped epithelial cell, and you'll see pictures of squamous-shaped cells, cuboidal-shaped cells, and even our third type of epithelial cell, which is a columnar-shaped cell. These cells, again, have soft edges on them, but they are clearly taller than they are wide. So we would refer to these as columnar-shaped epithelial cells. And we will see these come in single layers or multiple layers. You've got examples of them that we'll see pictures of. But in addition to epithelial tissue, we're going to see another type of tissue. Let's bring this one down and over. I'll bring it somewhere right about here, and let's grab a different color to label our types of connective tissue. Connective tissue is going to take up a lot of space because connective tissue we're going to see is subdivided into 3 smaller groups. And I've actually tried to separate these in the section that represents connective tissue. I'll explain it in a second. But connective tissue, let's bring this down and let's separate it into something that we're going to put here. We'll just bring this down. We'll put another one here and a third type of connective tissue onto this branch. And hopefully I'm leaving myself enough room. I feel like I might not be. This first bar is going to represent what we call connective tissue proper. There is proper connective tissue, and this does what you think connective tissue would do. It holds things together. We're going to list examples of connective tissue proper. but we're going to compare it to what we call supporting connective tissue. And then the last one is fluid connective tissue. Three types of connective tissue. Let's get back over here to list connective tissue proper. In connective tissue proper, there are two types of connective tissue proper. One type is what we consider loose connective tissue. The other type of connective tissue is dense connective tissue. We will see three types of loose connective tissue and three types of dense connective tissue. They're all on your lab list. Examples of loose connective tissue. I'll keep with the blue color. There is what we call areolar tissue. This is a type of loose connective tissue proper. The other type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue. And the third type is reticular tissue. All types of loose connective tissue. There are three types of dense connective tissue that we need to be aware of. There is what is called dense regular connective tissue. There is dense irregular. And then the last one is called elastic tissue. We're going to see pictures of each of these. This elastic tissue is found within the walls of the aorta. There's a bunch of elastic fibers there, and as the heart pumps, that aorta has to expand out and accommodate all of that blood. And then it recoils and helps push blood down the rest of the aorta. So if we're making our list here, we've got three types of loose connective tissue and three types of dense connective tissue. All of them we can see pictures of over there on the side of the room. Let's jump to the other two types of connective tissue. There's not nearly as many examples of the other two types. So let me waddle over here. In terms of supporting connective tissue, there's only two categories. There is bone. We'll start with bone. And then the other one is cartilage. There are two types of bone. I'll just list spongy bone and compact bone. We have an example of compact bone over there that's our example of bone. There isn't a picture of spongy bone over there currently. We'll talk about bone, compact bone and spongy bone in the second unit. Also in the second unit, we look more closely at the different types of cartilage. But over there now, you can see the three different types of cartilage that we'll have to know later on in the semester. I'll just list them now. There is what we call hyaline cartilage. There is what we call elastic cartilage. Be careful not to confuse elastic cartilage with elastic tissue. Their names are very similar. They both have elastic fibers in them, but one of them is a type of cartilage, a type of supporting connective tissue. The other one is a type of connective tissue proper. You find it in the walls of the aorta. This elastic cartilage you find in only two places. In the earlobe is one of them, and then also in the epiglottis we'll talk about. The third type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. So three types of cartilage, and then finally I can waddle over to fluid connective tissue. There are only two types of fluid connective tissue. The first one is the only example of fluid connective tissue that we have in lab. It's a picture of blood. The other fluid connective tissue is lymph, the fluid that you would find within the walls of lymphatic vessels. Like I said, we just have the one example of blood. But we need to be aware of, where these different types of connective tissues fall. So we've done that. Let's now move to the other two types. Let me grab colors that are appropriate. And let's drop down to, we'll just move into this area right here. Our next type of tissue is going to be muscle tissue. let's look at muscle tissue. In your box for muscle tissue, you'll notice once again there's 3 types of cells that we need to be aware of for muscle tissue. We need to be able to recognize skeletal muscle, we need to be able to recognize cardiac muscle, and then finally we need to be able to recognize smooth muscle. There is only one of them that we are in voluntary control of. The other ones we are not in voluntary control of. The autopilot, the autonomic nervous system, controls those other 2 types of muscles. So we don't have to think about our heart beating. We don't have to think about the smooth muscle pushing food through our digestive system or constricting or dilating blood vessels to shunt blood around wherever it's needed. We'll see pictures of each of these 3 different muscle types. It's in the muscle section. I've got them all labeled: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And then finally, our final box takes us over here, where we will put nervous tissue. In this box of nervous tissue, there's only one slide that shows a sample of nervous tissue. And when we look inside that slide, you'll notice there are 2 types of cells. There are really large cells that we're going to call neurons. These are going to be the functional cells of the nervous system. They generate electrical impulses. They send signals all over the body. Versus the other type of cell that you find in nervous tissue. These are what we call neuroglial cells. These neuroglial cells are not like neurons. They do not send electrical impulses. Instead, they do a wide variety of other jobs, all of which support and help out their neurons as the neurons do the job of sending electrical impulses. There, if we're keeping track, are going to be 6 different types of neuroglial cells that we'll need to be aware of, and 3 different types of neurons, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself.